My name is Volker Wieland. I'm the organizer of the ECB and its Watchers Conference. We know each other well. There are many good friends here. So, President Lagarde, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, I'm very pleased to welcome you all to this conference. It brings together the ECB and its Watchers since 1999. We're very grateful to the ECB, to President Lagarde, to Philip Lane, who's always a sounding board for this, actually just like the previous chief economists, and we're grateful to the board members and governing council members for frequenting this conference so often. The ECB is celebrating its 25th birthday this year, so congratulations are going to be on order very soon. Today's conference is the 23rd installment of the series. We skipped 2 years along the way, but nevertheless, we also, of course, will celebrate a 25th birthday, even if we were lazy 1 or 2 years. There are also new offspring of this series, not directly our initiative, but others who pick up the format. So, for example, on November 11 last year, the inaugural meeting of the SNB and its Watchers, so the Swiss National Bank and its Watchers, took place at the University of Bern. I think Harry Stellas, who is the organizer, is also here today, or will be here today. And then on November 24th last year, the first meeting of the Bank of England Watchers at King's College, London. And for a good number of years, there's been the US Multi-Policy Forum in the United States. So we're very happy to see that the format is adopted elsewhere. Last year, we met at Frankfurter Hof with a smaller group of attendees. Maybe it doesn't look that way. That year it looked very full, very crowded, but it was a much smaller room. Today we can seat 600 people and we will have in total 370 participants. But last year we met at Frankfurter Hof with a smaller group because of the coronavirus situation. And of course I'm delighted that we are back on Goethe University campus this year. That's our home base, and particularly here, you know, I'm very happy this is working out this year. Last year, we met just 3 weeks following the Russian attack on Ukraine. And as I was preparing for today, I looked at my welcome remarks from last year, and back then I said, we are faced with what is likely to turn into a long-term conflict between the West and Russia, a conflict fought on the battlefields in Ukraine, but also in the economic and financial sphere. And so it has turned out. Ukraine has put up a tremendous fight. Over time, the West has substantially increased military supplies and other resources supplied to Ukraine. And still more is needed. And here in Germany, huge work still needs to be done in order to strengthen our defensive capabilities to the point so we can actually defend ourselves. Again, I'm giving in a little bit to the temptation to repeat what I said last March, except now these issues have become reality. To win a conflict, you have to, achieve a position of strength, and double-digit inflation and economic stagnation does not indicate a position of strength. Instead, price stability is strength, financial stability is strength, sustainable growth is strength, debt sustainable is strength. So there's a lot to do for economic policy at large. Today, we also have some academic colleagues from Ukraine in the audience who have sought refuge in Frankfurt. We also hope that representatives from the Central Bank of Ukraine can join us at some other time. It was not possible today. But let me emphasize to those here that our thoughts and prayers are with you, your family and friends, and all the people living in Ukraine and defending their home. You will prevail. Last year, I see your agreement. Last year, President Lagarde said in her speech that in a severe scenario, inflation could average over 7% in 2022 in the euro area. In the end, and the severe scenario also had to do with gas delivery, natural gas deliveries, and this potential stop to Europe from Russia. And in the end, Headline inflation even went briefly into double digits and stood at 9.2% by December 2022. With energy prices falling, headline inflation will come down this year. However, core inflation is still rising and most recently stood at 5.6%. Since July 2022, the ECB has raised policy rates by 3.5 percentage points, with the market-relevant deposit facility rate reaching 3% effective today. On top of that, we have had 2 very busy weekends for bank supervisors in the United States and Switzerland following the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank and the crisis at Credit Suisse. Both were deemed systemic. SVB depositors were protected from any losses by US government intervention. Credit Suisse was force-fed to UBS at a heavily marked down price with extensive government guarantees and liquidity. So who's next? That's a question probably many in this room are asking themselves. The long period of near-zero interest rates and huge asset purchases by central banks, called for by the threat of low inflation and deflation, they also pushed an asset price boom, partly intentional, and a buildup of interest rate risk on bank balance sheets. The quick policy tightening that is necessitated by the inflation surge is causing losses and asset price reversals. Now, the effectiveness of the bank capital rules, prudential policies, and procedures for bank resolution or bank rescue that were installed after the global financial crisis are being tested. We now turn to President Lagarde. I already said there is a lot to do for economic policy at large, but we turn to you to find out what more the ECB can contribute at this point in time to help Europe regain a position of strength. President Lagarde, everyone here, of course, knows you, your exceptional career, and the many positions of great responsibility you have held in past years. We're happy someone with that experience is here today in this room and dealing with these issues with your extensive staff and colleagues. So I will not list your many accomplishments in further detail. I will just have one wish for you as well as for us. When you took up the presidency of the European Central Bank, right, there was this brief period, these few weeks of November and December 2019, and perhaps also in January 2020, that was a brief period of quiet and calm. And just before a series of storms hit. It was a time to sit back and think about some things. So my wish for you and for us is that eventually, right, perhaps in the medium to longer term, another period of quiet and calm will be on the horizon. So without further ado, may I ask you to the podium, President Lagarde, and thank you for talking to us.
Guten Morgen, good morning, bonjour, and thank you very much, dear friend, as we are amongst friends today, for giving me the chance to address this audience. I'd like to mention that there might not be National Central Bank of Ukraine representatives in this room, but there might be future members of the National Central Bank of Ukraine, because I know that there are some interns that we are hosting at the ECB during this period of turmoil back in their home country, and I know that they are enjoying being with us and learning along the way, so that when victory returns, they will be able to serve their country. Speaking of crisis, actually, there's one person that I would like to quote here, and that is my husband. He has actually asked me to not move to any new position at any point in time, because the track record of me moving to a new position is inevitably associated with a series of crises that come after a couple of months of calm and peace, you're right. So for once, maybe I'll listen to him. Let me turn to the serious matters now. As you said, the euro area has been hit by an inflation shock, which is now working its way through the economy. While headline inflation is likely to decline steeply this year, driven by falling energy prices and easing supply bottlenecks, underlying inflation dynamics remain strong. And in such an environment, our ultimate goal is clear. We must and we will bring down inflation to our medium-term target in a timely manner. But to achieve this goal, we need a robust strategy which takes into account the high level of uncertainty that we are facing today. As John Maynard Keynes once observed, I quote him here, "It would be foolish in forming our expectations to attach great weight to matters which are very uncertain." We might just be in those times where matters are very uncertain. In current conditions, a robust strategy calls for a data-dependent approach to making policy and a clear reaction function so that the public understands the sources of information that will be important to us. To that end, our future policy path will be determined by three factors. One, our assessment of the inflation outlook in the light of economic and financial data. Two, the dynamics of underlying inflation. And three, the strength of our monetary policy transmission. At the same time, I have made clear that there is no trade-off between price stability and financial stability. We have plenty of tools to provide liquidity support to the financial support if needed, and to preserve the smooth transmission of our monetary policy. In my remarks today with you, I will discuss our policy path so far and what lies ahead. And I will explain the reaction function that will govern our future rate decisions. So let us start with the path so far. Last year, inflation in the euro area surged strongly and spread deeply because it was driven by two types of shocks which hit the economy at the same time. First, we underwent an unprecedented series of negative supply shocks caused by pandemic-induced supply chain disruptions, Russia's unacceptable and unjustified invasion of Ukraine, and the ensuing energy crisis. And this significantly increased input costs for all sectors of the economy. Second, we faced a positive demand shock caused by the reopening of the economy after the pandemic. This seems long forgotten, and there is only one person with a mask on his head today. Remember 2 years ago, everybody shut down, away, not going out? And then demand arose. That favorable demand environment allowed firms to pass rising input costs through to prices much faster than in the past. We were eager to buy and to consume. This initially placed important emphasis on signaling, that is, demonstrating through actions and commitments that monetary policy would cover the necessary ground decisively. And that is why we put a great emphasis on the pace of our action, by hiking rates in large increments. I remember the long debates as to whether we should start with 25 basis points or maybe 50. And we did go for 50 precisely for those reasons. And we also communicated a clear upward path for rates so that the public could be confident that monetary policy was on an anti-inflationary path and that rates would soon leave accommodative territory. In a sense, an emphasis on data dependence was less important because monetary policy had distance to cover across all scenarios. But as inflation outlook evolved, it became clear that a pure normalization of policy, which would imply achieving a broadly neutral stance, would not suffice in itself. The combination of shocks had two effects, on distance and persistence, which warranted further policy action. First, the shocks increased the distance of inflation from our target. Even though inflation has likely passed its peak, it is descending from very high levels, and it is projected to be too far above our target for too long. And the longer inflation is too high, the greater the danger is that it remains so. Second, the shocks also increased the risks that above target inflation becomes more persistence, so distance and persistence. In particular, price pressures have broadened and deepened. Measures of underlying inflation tracked by the ECB currently range between 4 and 8%. In this setting, we need to bring rates to sufficiently restrictive levels to dampen demand. And in doing so, we could keep a firm grip on inflation expectations and ensure that they remain anchored. That is a key reason why we are committed to raise interest rates at a steady pace over recent meetings and significantly. And that is why we decided last week that a further 50 basis point hikes was necessary. So this is the path that we covered. Let's look at what lies ahead now. Now that a sizable policy adjustment is already behind us, as you mentioned, Volker, since July last year, we have raised interest rates by 350 basis points. However, inflation is still high, and uncertainty around its path ahead has increased even more recently. This makes a robust strategy going forward essential, and such a strategy has 3 elements. First, with high uncertainty, it is even more important that the rate path is data dependent. This means ex ante that we are neither committed to raise further, nor are we finished with hiking rates. Indeed, as I explained last week, if the baseline scenario in our most recent projections is confirmed, we will still have ground to cover to make sure that inflation pressures are stamped out. Second, while the European banking sector is resilient, with strong capital and liquidity position, in view of recent financial market volatility, we are ready to act and to provide liquidity support to the financial system if needed, and to preserve the smooth transmission of our monetary policy. But it should be clear that there is no trade-off between price stability and financial stability. And as we have demonstrated many times, we are able to set the appropriate policy stance to control inflation and at the same time use other instruments to address risks to monetary policy transmission. For instance, we did this when we decided to use reinvestments under the Pandemic Emergency Purchase Programme more flexibly and when we agreed on the transmission projection instrument. These programs ensured that rate normalization proceeded smoothly. The third element of a robust strategy is a clear reaction function. At our last meeting, we clarified our reaction function and the sources of information that would be important to us. The future calibration of the rate path will be determined by and will require continuous monitoring of 3 key inputs. And that's what I will try to clarify now, those 3 key inputs that we will be watching very carefully in the weeks and the months to come. The first input is our assessment of the inflation outlook in light of the incoming economic and financial data. This will be informed primarily by our staff inflation projections. Monetary policy must be forward-looking, given the lags with which policy works. And the staff inflation projections are the best mechanism for distilling incoming economic and financial data into a comprehensive picture of medium-term inflation dynamics. The future path will depend on whether we see inflation converging durably to our target in our forecast and the level of confidence we have in this convergence as captured by the balance of risks. Our latest forecasts sees headline inflation at 2.1% in 25 and core inflation at 2.2% in 25, which is a downward revision compared with our last projection round in December. But the confidence band around these forecasts is now unusually wide. As the cutoff date for the projection round was in early March, the forecasts do not incorporate the effects of the recent financial market tensions. And those tensions have added new downside risks and have made the risk assessment blurrier. More generally, many of the assumptions in the projections, such as those on fiscal policies, on energy, food prices, are volatile. This implies additional uncertainty around the baseline for both growth and inflation. Now, some of this uncertainty will recede as the fallout from recent events in financial markets becomes clearer. But faced with overlapping shocks and shifting geopolitics, the level of uncertainty will most likely remain high. To confirm the outlook in our projections over time, we therefore also need to look at additional indicators that can be observed in real time. And I come to my second point. We will be drawing on the dynamics of underlying inflation. Now, underlying inflation is not a policy target, but measures of underlying inflation can very well serve as a complementary cross-check of our forecasting process. Underlying inflation is typically quite inertial and therefore gives us an indication about the persistence of inflation into the medium term. We will be looking to see a sustained downward turn in underlying inflation measures to be confident that the inflation path will converge to our target in the medium term. So far, we do not see clear evidence that underlying inflation is trending downwards. In fact, we see two forces pushing underlying inflation in two different directions. To one side, falling energy prices are weakening a key driver of underlying inflation pressures. Imported energy prices have played a central role in pushing up inflation to all economic sectors, given the huge energy shock we have faced. And this is why measures of underlying inflation that capture the more persistent effects of energy cost are already now showing a decline. That's going in one direction. Now let's look at the other direction. To the other side, we have increasing domestic price pressures that could offset some of this disinflationary pressure. Measures of underlying inflation that capture items sensitive to the business cycle, such as our supercore, or items with low import content are still strengthening. If this continues and aggregate demand picks up from its current compressed levels, we could see a handover from imported to domestic price pressures that keep overall price pressures high. The key issue in determining which of these two forces wins out will be developments in wages. The euro area has suffered a large terms of trade loss owing to rising energy prices, the cost of which must ultimately be shared between firms and workers. And it is important that there is fair burden sharing between them, with both accepting that they cannot fully recover the income that the euro area has paid to the rest of the world and the ensuing loss of output. So far, real wages have decreased substantially, while firm profit margins have expanded in many sectors. But the labor market is quite tight. Labor shortages are increasing, and the terms of trade shock has largely reversed. So this is leading workers to use their bargaining power to recoup that lost income. For the 7 countries covered by the ECB wage tracker, collective bargaining during 2022 led to an aggregate wage rise of 4.7% for this year. this is already playing a stronger role in core inflation. While wage-sensitive items contributed only around 0.5 percentage point to core inflation before the pandemic, that contribution has more than doubled in the recent months. So if both workers and firms accept fair burden sharing and stronger wage growth represents merely a rebalancing between labor and capital, then both wage and price pressures should diminish as this process plays out. But if both parties attempt to unilaterally minimize their losses, we could see a feedback mechanism between higher profit margins, wages, and prices. The risk of such a tit-for-tat dynamic is also heightened by the prospect that labor market tightness will linger. Unlike other jurisdictions, labor participation in the euro area has grown robustly since last year, helping to address part of the soaring labor demand driven by the reopening. But the pandemic has also led to a sharp increase in public employment, reducing, as a result, the pool of labor available for the private sector. And how much further labor supply can expand overall will depend, among other things, on complex policy questions such as countries' attitudes towards immigration and childcare. At the same time, the unemployment rate is at a historical low, and in some countries it is so low that it will be increasingly difficult to recruit from the remaining pool of labor. All this means that we could see a more prolonged cost push shock coming from wage growth. This is unlikely to prevent good disinflation, since wages only represent about 20% of direct input cost for manufacturing firms. But wages make up around 40% of direct input cost for services providers. And services inflation accounts for almost 2/3 of core inflation. In parallel, firms' profit margins continue to grow, in part because some are taking advantage of supply-demand imbalances to test consumer demand with large price increases, often over and above their increase in cost. But in the absence of a persistent rise in market power, this can only continue insofar as demand remains resilient. Otherwise, firms will have to absorb cost increases in margins, and price pressure will start to ease. And this is where the third input comes in that we will use to assess the rate path, which is the strength of the transmission of our monetary policy measures in restricting demand. We saw a large contraction in domestic demand at the end of last year, and the latest data, such as retail sales, suggest that consumption has not yet rebounded. But this has not stopped cost increases from passing through. Short-term measures of momentum in core inflation, for instance, the 3 months on 3 months rate, actually increased in February. There are two factors which could explain this apparent resilience. The first one is the atypical buffers for consumptions that households have available in the current environment. They are still benefiting from sizable fiscal policy support to shield them from rising energy prices, amounting to around 250 billion euros in 22 and projected for 23. And they still have around 900 billion euros in excess savings built up during the pandemic. The second factor is the reduced sensitivity of the labor market to slowing growth, which is supporting labor income and households' employment expectations. Faced with labor shortages, firms are responding to weaker demand first by hoarding labor, that is, by further reducing hours worked rather than by cutting jobs. And now, with energy prices falling and wages rising, household disposable incomes are set to increase. This was reflected before the recent financial market tensions arose in our projections for a stronger recovery this year, from 0.5 to 1%. So for inflationary pressures to ease, it is important that our monetary policy works robustly in the restrictive direction. And that process is only starting to take effect now. The first leg of the monetary transmission process, from policy measures to financing and monetary conditions, is already having a substantial impact. The cost of borrowing is increasing steeply, and loan dynamics look to be contracting faster than during previous hiking cycles. Credit growth to firms has dropped markedly since the third quarter of 22. We are also seeing a tightening of money, with annual M1 growth turning negative for the first time since the creation of the euro. Although this is also being driven by the shifting of funds from overnight to better remunerated time deposits in the context of higher rates. For the second leg of the transmission process, so from tighter financing and monetary conditions to demand, there is currently more uncertainty. We know that the full effect of monetary policy on demand will only reveal itself over time. But both the strength and the speed of this process could have changed. Since the ECB last conducted a major hiking cycle in the mid-2000s, the financial structure of the euro area has evolved. The share of variable rate mortgages has fallen significantly, slowing the transmission of interest rate increases into debt payments. Excess savings and the low pass-through to deposit rates might also weaken incentives for households to save more of their income in response to higher policy rates. These factors could mean a weaker pass-through to consumption. At the same time, we have seen a very sudden shift from low for long rates to considerably higher levels. And this is already having an impact on more interest-sensitive demand components like investment. Housing investment has been falling for the past 3 quarters, and business investment also contracted at the end of last year. The greater role played today by sectors that rely on discounted future earnings, such as tech, could also make monetary transmission more powerful. What we will have to monitor carefully in the weeks and months to come is whether there is a further strengthening of this pass-through. If, for example, banks start to apply a larger intermediation wedge, meaning that at any level of the base rate, they demand a higher compensation for the perceived risk they are taking on when lending, then pass-through will become stronger. So we will be paying close attention to a range of indicators of credit availability and credit pricing, such as the monthly data on money and credit flows, our bank lending survey, of course, and our survey on access to finance for small and medium-sized enterprises. While more restrictive credit conditions are part of the mechanism by which our tightening ultimately reins in excess price pressures and brings inflation back to target, we will make sure that the process will be orderly throughout. So let me borrow from one of my compatriots, not my husband this time, but Voltaire. Voltaire said, "Uncertainty is an uncomfortable position." Oh yeah. But certainty is an absurd one. Faced with new and overlapping shocks, we have no choice today but to deal with uncertainty. But the public can be certain about one thing. We will deliver price stability, and bringing inflation back to 2% over the medium term is not negotiable. We will do so by following a robust strategy that is data dependent and embeds a readiness to act. But that does not entertain trade-offs around our primary objective. Faced with a world that is changing faster than any of us could have imagined, we need to be both focused on our goal and robust in our strategy to achieve it. And we will. Thank you very much.